Welcome back to Seaside Joe. Critics are saying Seaside Joe could be the next The Office or Superstore or American Auto, which I just saw that as a selling point for the new NBC show American Auto. They're saying it could be the next The Office. Critics are saying that it could be, hey, who knows? Anything is possible. Could be the next The Office or Superstore. Now, I didn't see much Superstore. I don't know if that's a hit out there, but can't imagine it's in the same universe as The Office or Seaside Joe, which are up in the stratosphere with zero errors. And speaking of no errors, I have not made one today in choosing a guest. Coming back once again, I couldn't compare him to anyone. He's incomparable, frankly. Mookie, how would I comp you to anybody? You're incomparable.
Well, thanks for having me on again, Kenneth. I mean, some people are comparing me to The Office, Superstore, American Auto, and others are comparing me to pretty much any sitcom that CBS runs right now that gets a laugh track and then people just pretending that they're actually interested in the show.
Yeah, that is. Do you know anyone who's interested in any shows right now?
Uh, Probably a few. Maybe there's only one that's got any decent acclaim, and that's Abbott Elementary on
Mm.
ABC. I've been too lazy. I got to check that out. It seems like a genuinely funny show, and who knows? Maybe that could also be the next Parks and Rec, but for school.
Yeah, it's I saw the first episode. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff out there, and Abbott Elementary is one of those things. And yeah, every show needs its time to grow. That first season of The Office isn't very. I mean, it's pretty good, but it's not that good. It's not as good as the third season. So um, this is probably the 12th season of me doing a Seahawks centric podcast, but maybe the first season in a long, long time that felt like there's a real seismic shift happening with the Seattle Seahawks. And that's because I really started right before Russell Wilson started, and Pete Carroll did very well for a while. And then 7-10 is the most recent season. So that's why I wanted to recommit myself to a weekly coverage of the Seahawks during their not a rebuilding phase, but potentially a pre-building phase. Because Mookie, if we were just saying it right before the podcast, but if the Seahawks do 7-10 or worse next season, I just don't see how anybody repeats that. I don't see how anybody, whether it's Russell Wilson saying, "Hey, I don't know how much longer I got out here," or whether it's Pete Carroll not getting another chance because he's fired. I don't think 7-10 could happen again without there being the changes that some people thought should happen or potentially still could happen this season. Where do you think? How realistic do you think it is for the Seahawks to improve upon 7-10? Or if we're being really realistic, how realistic is it for the Seahawks to go 10-7 or better?
Well, it's realistic for them to get better than 7-10 just by having Russell Wilson available for 17 games. Uh, that's for starters. And even when he is available, we got to make sure he's not as injured and clearly not playing at 100% like he was against Green Bay and Arizona. But this team does need quite a bit of work, and there's so many free agents that they have to consider re-signing, or they're going to have to move on from. Think about the offensive line, which, if you're a Seahawks fan, you're always thinking about the offensive line, probably a lot more than the general manager and the head coach do. But Dwayne Brown, free agent; Ethan Posick, free agent; Brandon Shell, free agent. So you could be looking at three new starters next season. Jake Curran, presumably, would be a favorite to take the starting job over at right tackle if
Mm.
they let Shell walk. But center, I think he can do better than Posick, but he's also not terrible. Kyle Fuller, though, those first couple of months were unacceptably bad, and I can't believe that this team pretty much repeated the Drew Nowak mistake from
Mm.
2015. And then Dwayne Brown, he looked rough for parts of this season, and then he started to look more like his normal self, but it's always a huge risk banking on another good season from somebody who's past 35, pretty much at any position, but especially along the offensive line. So left tackle is a big question mark if they don't resign Dwayne Brown, because Stone Forsythe is just a project that they've pretty much not even tried to play in the regular season. So I think the offensive line's a major starting point for them to tweak. Certainly, it can get better than what we saw this season. And then defensively, the secondary, we got DJ Reed, a free agent, Sidney Jones, free agent. Trey Brown hopefully can come back before the next regular season starts and he can be inserted into the starting lineup again. But Quandre Diggs, there are two issues there. One is his injury, a really unfortunate broken fibula and then dislocated ankle. And then the second bit is he is a free agent. And what is his market value now, having come off such a catastrophic injury? Really the first bad injury of his career. Bobby Wagner, not a free agent, but he costs a lot of money. And even though he's been racking up the tackles, the eye test, never mind, I'm sure metrics can also back this up. This is not the same Bobby Wagner from 2012 to 2015. So there's a whole lot going on with the Seahawks in the secondary, at linebacker, and even on the defensive line. Like, are they going to keep Carlos Dunlap for another season after he went 3 months with one sack and then finished with what, 7.5 over the last few weeks? What about Rasheem Green, who's also a free agent? So there's so many interesting things for the Seahawks to deal with. That's yeah, they probably can be better next season, but it also doesn't take a whole lot for it to get worse.
The Kansas City Chiefs, they quite notably rebuilt the offensive line over the offseason and seemed to be better for it, but it did cost them quite a lot in terms of money and draft compensation, sending a first round pick for Orlando Brown when he is going to be a free agent this year and cost an extreme amount of money. And they also signed Joe Thuney and worked it through the draft. And there was a lot going on there. The New England Patriots redirecting their course after so many years of not buying into free agency and then becoming the most spendy team in free agency. And it got them to the playoffs, but then that only got them blown out by the Buffalo Bills. And a lot of the money that the Patriots spent didn't really go to good use, I think. And so for the Seahawks, they do have this so-called amount of money to spend, 50, 55 million, whatever it is. I also spoke to John Gilbert after his last podcast appearance a little bit more about the salary cap. And, basically once you really account for everything that the Seahawks have to do, maybe they have 20 to 25 million to spend, but that could still all go to some of their outgoing free agents. And Jackson Bevins, when he came on the podcast, talking about how in his dream scenario, it would be something like the Chiefs going out there and spending for the premium free agent offensive lineman rather than waiting for the Jake Curhans. Where exactly do you think your financial intentions would lie for the Seahawks in terms of should Pete Carroll catch up maybe to whatever, should he change his philosophies a little bit, change the way he does business in free agency, or do you think it's not worth overreacting to say, your first losing season in 10 years?
I would like them to change their philosophy because it feels like this is a little too close to the Green Bay model, which is logical given John Schneider's background. But you can only go so far with 1 year signings of players in the second and third wave of free agency and still be a competent team. It's been a hit and miss history with them with free agency. And a lot of it is them just trying to revive the careers of players. I mean, think about Dion Jordan, Ziggy Ansah, who only exists theoretically to me after that season he had in Seattle in
Yeah.
2019. Or reviving players or trying to get the best out of players who are past their prime. So think of Greg Olson last season. Seattle had like 50 million in cap space then, and they gave Greg Olson several $1 million, and it didn't work out all that well. So it's been a problem for the Seahawks in the sense that they could have gotten away with that 6-7 years ago when the drafting was much better. But the drafting, while I'm pretty optimistic about the 2020 class, it's not at the same level as 2010 through 2012, where you're nabbing multiple Pro Bowl caliber receivers or Pro Bowl caliber players in general, and potential future Hall of Famers and guaranteed Hall of Famers in the case of, say, Richard Sherman and Bobby Wagner. So I don't think they can keep going cheap here. They got to make, especially on the offensive line, they have made some investments. Like they traded a fourth rounder for Gabe Jackson, and they gave him a contract extension. But that's pretty much it. I mean, Posick is a free agent, but even if they resign him, it's not going to be on some big deal. Damian Lewis is still on his rookie contract. If Jake Curran starts next season over Brandon Shell, he's on a rookie deal, and he's an undrafted free agent, so he's even cheaper. Left tackle, that's a big question mark. Do they want to gamble again, given what happened the last time they had question marks there? Because Russell Okung, they did not want to resign. He went to, I think the Chargers it was, or he went to Denver and then the Chargers. And their replacement was what, Jamarcus Webb, Bradley Sowell. I mean, just Reese Odiyamo as well. It was a revolving door at that position, and it proved to be a disaster. All of that is what led to trading for Dwayne Brown in the first place. So I think they got to be a lot more proactive with getting established talent in free agency. They really need talent because we know having great talent helps you win in the NFL, helps you win in
Right.
just about any sport. But in the NFL, the talent advantage that we see for the elite teams compared to tier 2 and tier 3, it's not like college, but
Yeah.
it's pretty noticeable. You can't really look at the Seahawks roster and say, wow, they are right up there in terms of overall talent with Green Bay or Buffalo or Kansas City. They're just
Yeah.
not.
To that point, you bring up Green Bay, and it makes me think like following the Green Bay model. It's interesting to think about why the Packers are the Packers and the Seahawks are the Seahawks. And that means that over the last 5-6 years, you want to go, neither team has been to the Super Bowl, but the Packers are consistently getting the number 1 seed or right around the number 1 seed, consistently getting to the NFC Championship game. And while they still have fallen short, there's just no denying that the Packers have been a more fun team to watch, a better team. And to follow their model, I just look at it up and down the roster. And with all due respect to Russell Wilson and the other players on the Seahawks, who for the most part, of the decade were very good. Russell Wilson is not Aaron Rodgers, and DK Metcalf is not Devontae Adams, and the Seahawks hadn't had any hits on the offensive line like David Bakhtiari, and Poona Ford and Jaron Reed are not Kenny Clark, and the Seahawks haven't had as much consistency from any running back like the Packers have had with Aaron Jones and his dependability and what he does week after week. Seahawks have not had any real pass rushing hits even like Rashawn Gary. They haven't had any real cornerback draft picks like Jair Alexander, and they had the opportunity to draft Jair Alexander instead trading down and getting Rashad Penny. The Seahawks, I mean, just when I think about why are the Packers like the Packers and the Seahawks like the Seahawks, and consistently you just don't feel that fear for Seattle like people fear Green Bay. It's very simple. The Seahawks aren't doing as well in finding the best players. And when we're talking about being good, the Seahawks are nailing being good. When we're talking about being the best, the Seahawks are as much in the conversation as the Arizona Cardinals are, as much in the conversation as the Minnesota Vikings are, the Atlanta Falcons are. These are teams that I don't really feel to be in the conversation. So I do have just like huge reservations about running it back and expecting a different result. What were your thoughts? Because this is the first podcast I've done since the news the only news that really Seattle has delivered being the firing of Ken Norton Jr. and Andre Curtis. And then in the interim or the time between then, I've only read that they've talked to Ed Donatel, which inspires honestly the same confidence as Ken Norton Jr., even if it's potentially better, I guess. It doesn't really do anything to change my view on how the Seahawks defense. It seems like the move you expected, and nobody said they wanted the move that they kind of expected. So what do you expect from the coaching changes next year?
Well, it looks like Carroll and Schneider are going to stay. I think it's the absolute last chance for them next season, and I kind of already referenced that. But on the coordinator side, it feels like Shane Waldron kind of saved his job over the last month, or maybe Rashad Penny saved Shane Waldron's job because uh, the involvement of him in the running game and the success that they had, I think, kind of freed up Waldron to run the plays that he probably wanted to run, and they just executed better because otherwise, even before Wilson got injured, it was still a very up and down offensive performance where, yeah, their highs were really high, but then they would just go 3 and out 5 times in a row. So statistically, this is the worst any Seahawks offense has been under Russell Wilson, regardless of coordinator, since maybe the 2017 year where they pretty much had no running game at all. So Waldron, I think, got a reprieve. But for Norton, I've been on Norton's back for a while. I think I've written on field goals reasons to fire him 3 straight seasons. So I guess the third time was the charm. You know what? In defense of Norton, to a degree, is that he just doesn't have the same roster strength as Dan Quinn did. He doesn't have several Hall of Famers and all pro level players on that team now. He does have some talent. He's got Jamal Adams. He has Diggs. You have some promising talent in Darrell Taylor and Trey Brown, but they're taking time to develop, guys like Brown and Taylor. But otherwise, I just haven't been satisfied with the results of Norton as a defensive coordinator. They were flat out bad in 2019, and they were a major reason why Seattle was playing so many close games. And then over these last couple of seasons, they came out of the gates so poorly, where it looked like there was complete disorganization. They had no idea what to do. And then they were able to right the ship towards the second half of the season. So this year, they finished, I think, 11th in points allowed, which is pretty good. I won't knock that. But the advanced metrics, like DVOA, expected points added, they don't take kindly to the Seahawks at all. I
Mm-hmm.
think part of that is the lack of a pass rush. I mean, they were near the
Mm-hmm.
bottom in sacks, and then this could be tied to it: the lack of turnovers. They only had 18 takeaways this season. That's the fewest in franchise history, and that's pretty bad when you consider they added an extra game this year. So 18 takeaways, 11 interceptions, and like 8 of those picks were off of 3 quarterbacks: Stafford, Garoppolo, and Tim Boyle. And Tim Boyle gave him 3. And Tim Boyle was also the only quarterback that any Seahawks cornerback intercepted all season. So you add that to the lack of the fumbles they even forced. They only forced 9 fumbles, and 3 of them were on special teams. So it's all about the ball. Kind of just gave way to we don't want to take too many risks. And it seems to me that at the expense of getting beat over the top and giving up explosive pass plays, they are just willing to take death by 1,000 cuts because they give up a lot of 10-yard plays here, 15-yard plays there. And I don't think Carroll is particularly pleased with the fact that they had so many long drives allowed both this season and last season. People forget Seattle's defense had the most plays faced last year too. And the
Mm-hmm.
offense was way better last year than this year. So the defense has got to take some responsibility. So Norton's is not like the worst defensive coordinator in the league or anything, but I feel like you can upgrade from there. That's the thing with the Seahawks. There's no one spot where I think, wow, they're the worst in the league at this or near the worst. But they're also at a point where there are a lot of positions, both in the coaching ranks and on the roster, where you think, yeah, they can do better. And they should try and do better because, as you said, they're kind of in that same bucket as Arizona or other fringe playoff teams or actual playoff teams that are never really threatening past the divisional round.
We're at a certain point in Seattle Seahawks history or whatever where I think it's okay to ask certain questions without or envision certain scenarios without a backlash. So I'm kind of emphasizing that or preempting what I'm about to say to anybody listening to this. That's like you're not allowed to talk about trading Russell Wilson, but I understand that to say that because I was here all of last year and I kept saying day after day after day, just as everybody else was saying, to talk and wanting to talk about a Russell Wilson trade. I was saying, well, it's just not going to happen this year, so I'm not going to talk about it. And that's the reason I didn't talk about it last year, because I really felt like, well, I know it's not going to happen this year, so why am I wasting? Let's find out what happens this upcoming season. I think the season was bad enough that it's not hard to buy the premise the rumor that Russell Wilson wants to explore other options. Not that difficult to believe. And I think also it's worth exploring in the modern era of football if teams can actually improve themselves by not tying themselves to franchise quarterbacks of such an expensive regard. If the Seahawks do trade Russell Wilson, it's $26 million in dead money, $11 million in savings, and that's considerable money for a team that could also use extra finances to keep certain players together and to add outside free agents that, maybe it's a certain point. I've always said free agency is overrated, but there are certainly free agents, singular, that can be game changing and totally franchise changing. So it's very important to be able to make a play for those guys as well sometimes. So, the Seahawks could actually get a lot of cap space if they were actually more content or okay with hitting a certain reset button. Let me ask you this, Mookie. Do you think the Seahawks could get better without Russell Wilson or trading Russell Wilson? Do you think that the Seahawks could actually go, and even if they will not do better at quarterback next season than Russell Wilson, do you think that there is a version of Seattle that might band together and might come together and might be able to play well in spite of not having, a Pro Bowl caliber quarterback to come together next season, because Seattle could recoup some draft picks, could use some cap space. They could even move on from Bobby Wagner and have a lot of cap space. Do you see a version of Seattle that could potentially get better if they did trade Russell Wilson?
I do not. And a lot of it is I don't trust the current front office, meaning, of course,
Mm.
John and Pete, to find an adequate replacement quarterback, because preceding Russell Wilson, they made two moves, which was sign DeVaris Jackson, and that was a 1-year holdover deal.
Uh-huh.
And he did what he could. May he rest in peace. He was battling through injury for much of that season. And then before that was the quite ludicrous trade for Charlie Whitehurst. Like,
Mhm.
even with the hindsight, that trade does not hold up well whatsoever. That they traded down in the draft, and they gave up a third rounder the following year to the Chargers for a guy who had been in the league 4 or 5 years and had never thrown an NFL pass.
Yeah.
And he had no future other than like spot starts here and there, both in Seattle and Tennessee, and bang, he's out of the league. So yeah, he did help he did help the Seahawks get into the playoffs in 2010 with the Week 17 win, but all in all, bad quarterback, bad trade. So I don't trust them to recreate that magic and find a Wilson successor. Now, it's a little different if they were to trade Wilson and get a franchise quarterback, an established franchise quarterback in return. So I'm not talking about guys who have to be built up. So if they hypothetically traded Russell Wilson to Philadelphia for Jalen Hurts, there's a pretty clear drop off to me in level of play from Russell Wilson to Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts at this point of his career, much more dangerous rusher than Russell Wilson. And that's to be expected. Wilson's 33, going to be 34 this year. But as a passer, it's not there. And you can't really compete in today's NFL if you don't have a consistent quarterback, if you don't have quarterbacks who are consistently dangerous throwers. So I
Totally.
think there's room for Seattle to free up some cap space by letting go of a legend, but it's not Russell Wilson. It probably would be Bobby. And it pains me to say that because I don't want the last play of his career to be that injury against Detroit. I think we've seen this too many times where a Seahawks player ends their career getting injured. So
Mhm.
he's been a stalwart. He's going to be in Canton. But without looking it up, I think that Seattle saves like 8 figures worth in cap space if they cut him next season.
Yeah.
So they're probably ready for Jordan Brooks to take more responsibility. Now, the only issue there is they need another linebacker because they don't have a lot of depth there. They got Cody Barton, who's struggled to get on the field until these last couple of games. And Ben Burke-Kirven is mostly on special teams. And they've been playing guys like Benson Mayo and Carlos Dunlap and Daryl Taylor as kind of this outside linebacker role at the Sambacker spot. So I don't know. I feel like the Seahawks, as they're constructed now, would absolutely collapse with a worse quarterback than Russell Wilson. If we
Yeah.
had this conversation 6, 7 years ago before his first contract was up, I would think a little differently. But
Yeah.
now the roster is just not good enough for them to overcome a substantial reduction in quarterback play.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, I feel like I agree with everything you just said, because at the beginning I was like, maybe it could work, and now I think you're absolutely right. Like, you can't, you also you said the two moves before 2012, but the Seahawks also paid all that money to Matt Flynn. So, it's like, do they really know anything? They didn't even really want Russell Wilson. Pete Carroll wasn't even like that into Russell Wilson. And so, yeah, it's hard to know what to do sometimes with Seattle, because I just don't think that they're a contender with what they're doing. And I don't know, maybe the move, I do think, like, I agree. I feel like if you trade Russell Wilson, that is like a clear sign that success would be hard to come by. The when the Patriots had to go the 2008 season with Matt Castle and they went 11-5, like, that was like, so that team had to have so much going for it. And this, plus they also played in the AFC East, and the Seahawks have to keep up with the 49ers, the Rams, and the Cardinals. And so it's going to be, anytime you throw up the white flag right now in the NFC West, like trading Russell Wilson, you don't know how long you're going to be at the bottom. So very risky to do that. And as I've been writing on the newsletter as well, I think that it's important not to overrate first round picks. Seattle doesn't have a first round pick. That's okay. A first round pick didn't really help them all that much to get to the Super Bowl, other than, their first couple there in 2010. But Bruce Irvin wasn't the big deal in 2012. And I don't even know that you can trust Seattle, like you're saying, to draft the right guy or do the right thing in the first round anyway. So who knows what you would really get out of that. As far as trading Russell Wilson, though, I did mention the Eagles thing as well on the newsletter. And, I think that any move with Russell Wilson has to include a premium elite draft pick, because I think that that is what it deserves. And I don't think that 3 mid first round picks really send the right signal. You really have to get like a top 5 pick, as well as more on top of that, in my opinion. But the Jalen Hurts, I considered also like, oh, what about Jalen Hurts? And then I was like, oh, you know what? Jalen Hurts doesn't mean anything to me. Like, that doesn't change the value of the trade whatsoever to me, to just include Jalen Hurts if the Eagles were to do that, because like you said, I just don't think that he's got the arm to be much of an NFL starter at this point. But the Eagles did get to the playoffs and the Seahawks did not. What would you say is going to be the priority, or a way for Seattle to get involved with finding great pass rush? Is it about changing some more of Pete's philosophies? Is about bringing in the right defensive coordinator, or is that maybe where to spend some money?
Well, right now, with where they are with their pass rush, like I don't know if you can bank on Dunlap having another strong finish like he did last season, where on the totality of his season, it looks like, wow, 8.5 sacks in over the course of the season, and he ends up leading the team in sacks. Well, as I mentioned, he was quiet and hardly getting snaps up until the last month of the year. So you're relying on your best young talent, which would be Darrell Taylor, and he had what, 6 sacks, and he was somebody who didn't play in his rookie year because of his recovery from
Do you
surgery.
think Carlos Dunlap, do you think that he do you think there's any part of that game there where Carlos Dunlap gets all of his sacks at the end of the year, because at a certain point he's like, I'm going to freelance, I'm going to do what I need to do, I don't have any sacks, I'm just going to go ahead and, or do you think like he just generally started winning? Because how do you like sort of justify or like think about the reason for how he had so many sacks in the last 4 games.
Well, it looked like he was just winning more with power over speed, and probably at this stage of his career, it's only logical. Like I think of the sack he had against Jimmy Garoppolo for a safety, he just ran over their right tackle. He did a couple of similar moves against the Rams, although I think they were playing their backup right tackle in the rematch. So I don't remember the backup right tackle's name. I think it's Bobby Evans. He even got one
Yes.
on Whitworth, and Whitworth is an outstanding, if not past his prime tackle, but still overall he's a really good player. So uh, basically, the Seahawks did change some things schematically, and we saw Dunlap in coverage a little bit too much for my liking. But in general, Seattle does need, at least from Carroll's perspective, they need dominant pass rush. And I'm talking like top 10 in the league, because without it, you're asking a lot out of those corners. And I think part of why Carroll decided to be more conservative with cover two over cover three and trying to limit the explosive plays is that he had to have known that pass rush was not going to get home on a consistent basis. And you're leaving cornerbacks out on an island. And more often than not, they're at a disadvantage with the receiving talent opposite them. So the way to fix that is you got to get better pass rushers. So I can bank on Daryl Taylor developing. I'm a believer in his potential. Rasheem Green, he's a good rotational piece, but I don't know if you want to spend too much money on him. I hope he stays because just on the pick two, not pick two, the kick two, where he got the blocked extra point, returned it back. But he's shown some promise. But LJ Collier, no need to get a fourth year on him. Puna Ford and Brian Monet are much better at run stuffing than pass rushing. I think they need a proper pass rushing defensive tackle as well. And it's kind of akin to when they had Brandon Mebane. Brandon Mebane and Clinton McDonald, they were very important parts of that Seahawks defense. When Dan Quinn was around, they were making the Super Bowl, but they haven't really been able to replicate that. But if they can get a quality edge rusher, I think that would change a lot for this team. Something like what Chicago did with Robert Quinn. Seattle could have gotten Quinn in that free agency. I think it was 2 seasons ago. And now look at Quinn. He breaks Richard Dent's franchise record for sacks in a season. And he did it before the 17 games, so no asterisk there. So I believe that the pass rush over the secondary is actually the big priority.
Yeah, I think you mentioned earlier that about how maybe Shane Waldron saved his job at the end of the year, and then you have Carlos Dunlap kind of igniting or reigniting faith in Carlos Dunlap just at the end of the year. And these games, happened at a time when Seattle knew that it was out of the playoffs and there was less pressure on Seattle, wasn't playing very well. So to go up and I just wonder, as much as the Seahawks are staying course, if the season had ended on that Bears game, maybe the whole, maybe the Seahawks would be doing head coaching interviews right now, just based on the order of the games and then playing bad teams at the end of the year. Like the Lions were one Jaguars victory or away from picking first this year, so basically just worst or one of the 2-3 worst teams in the NFL. The Cardinals, we saw that they looked like trash basically in the last 2 months of the season. And I'm trying to think back to the last time that the Seahawks, had one of those victories other than, we know that the Seahawks can beat the 49ers. To go back to a time when it was like they had one of those victories against a really good team, I don't even think it's happened in the last 2 years. I don't think that other than, and the 49ers are 10-7. So it's like, it's not like a great team. To go back to a time when the Seahawks were a team that was out there against a good team and they beat a good team, you would have to go back at least 2-3 years. I think just looking at the schedule, I think like even this is a team that went to the playoffs and was winning 10-11 games. I think the Seahawks, you might have to go back to here. You got a Thursday night football game in 2018 that won against the Packers. Oh, they got to win over the Chiefs. So, maybe 2018 against the Chiefs was the last time. I mean, am I wrong or would you disagree with that?
Well, if we're going to exempt the 49ers games because
Yeah.
Seattle just beats San Francisco all the time, uh, probably the Kansas City game because the Chiefs were they were a defense away from going to the Super Bowl. Just any third down stop or D Ford not going offsides, they vanquished New England. And that was a genuinely good game. In fact, one of Ken Norton's best coached games with the way that they strategize against Mahomes. But I think about the 2019 team. They lost to Baltimore and they lost to them pretty badly at the end. They beat San Francisco, but we're discounting them for now. Even when they beat the Rams missed the playoffs that year. So they beat Minnesota, a wild card team. They got eliminated in the divisional round. But think about last season, they played Buffalo, an eventual AFC championship participant. They got destroyed. I mean, that was one of the
Yeah.
worst games I've ever seen out of a Pete Carroll team. And then you look at this season, yeah, they got 7 wins. They beat
Hmm.
Houston, Jacksonville, and Detroit. Those are presumably the 3 worst teams in the league.
Yeah.
Maybe you can add the Giants and Jets in there. Your mileage may vary, but still, those 3 teams, and then in the division, swept the Niners, and we're well established on that. Even the second Niners win, I think there is a semi asterisk, if there is such a thing that can exist, that Debo Samuel didn't play, and Samuel has shown himself to be one of the more valuable players in the league. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah, so we're up to 5 wins. They beat Arizona. It's a very good performance, but Arizona ended up losing their last 5 home games. And you got to wonder if the Kingsbury late season swoon is just a repeated pattern for them. And I'm just trying to think of their other wins. I'm at 6 now. Um, what would be their 7th win? The Colts. And that was probably their best performance of the season with the offense that they showed and the defensive stuff.
And that was Carson Wentz's first game with the Colts. He had missed the entire training camp with an injury, of course. Like that was a very that was the probably the Seahawks best performance. But again, like there's an asterisk, to which Colts team they were playing.
Yeah, and also from what I recall, they were missing a couple of starting offensive linemen due to injury. Their left tackle was out. I think Eric Fisher didn't play. But the Colts are a decent team, but we found out just what fraudsters they were at the end by losing to Jacksonville and ending up out of the playoffs entirely. So the number of actual signature wins this team has had in recent years doesn't rate compared to the early Seahawks teams where they blew out the Niners when the Niners eventually made the Super Bowl. They beat the Patriots, and the Patriots, I don't think they lost another game after that in the regular season. No, they lost like one more game after that in the regular season.
Mhm.
Or they blew out New Orleans in the 2013 season, beat the Packers on opening night in the regular season, met them again in the NFC Championship game. The list goes on and on. Whereas these last few years, more often than not, they've been able to beat the bad teams or the mediocre teams. They have the occasional embarrassing performance against the Bears or the Giants last year. But when it comes to beating like the upper echelon of the NFL, so we're talking, I think Buffalo is in that category now, or Buffalo or Green Bay or they haven't played Tampa Bay, so thank God they haven't. But those types of teams, they haven't really notched that type of wow victory where you think this team is going to be a serious threat to make the Super Bowl. It's just not been the same. I think if you look at their record, I'm sure I could pull it up on StatHead. Their record against eventual playoff teams over the last 3, 4 seasons has got to be under 500.
I think that sounds accurate. I think that that's really what I try and I hate to even sound like, oh, what I had tried to pound home with people or because it's like, I'm not trying to build a case against Pete Carroll or Russell Wilson or the Seahawks. It's just, there is just such a very flat out argument, I think, to be made that it's been years since Seattle was truly competitive for the Super Bowl. You cannot just go back to the divisional round of the playoffs as your goal every year. And by goal, I guess I mean like as your ceiling, because that's what it has been. The Seahawks haven't even been competitive when they get to the divisional round. So it's like you're rooting for it's not even like rooting for Gonzaga because Gonzaga gets to the national championship now. It's like you're rooting for a team that doesn't have or hasn't proven to have the ability to get back to where, what Malcolm Butler stole from them in the Super Bowl. It's like that was the closest that they could get. And then since then, it's just been all downhill from there. And at some point you have to go, when do we get to the fork in the road? That's where it's like, it's not a talented enough team where you're sitting here going like, I can't think of a time that the Seahawks would go up against a good quarterback on a good team at a time when they were good and beaten them. And, or, and really like, when's the last time? Because in the 2012, 13, 14, and 15 seasons, it was like, welcome to the slaughterhouse sometimes. And those days are long gone. I don't even have a question, but what do you think about that?
I think about their decline in dominance. I mean, it's really hard to have that level of success for that number
But
of
even have
years.
that level of success for 1 week,
Yeah,
Mookie. Just like when can they have it for 1 week?
yeah, and that's where the talent drop off has an impact, and they're having different players in and out of the lineup. So you think about the last few seasons, they've only won the NFC West one time
Yeah.
since 2017. So in that time, the Niners have won it once, the Rams have won it what 3 times, I think. Only Arizona has failed to win the division during that span. So Seattle also one playoff win over the last 5 seasons. Compare that to the Rams. Sean McVay is in the divisional round for the third time in 5 seasons. Kyle Shanahan, whom I'm not terribly high on as this amazing coach, he's taken this Niners team to the playoffs and past the first round for the second time now in 5 seasons. And the other 3 seasons, he didn't really have a quarterback. Like,
Yeah.
I can make fun of Garoppolo all I want, but 2020, he's playing with CJ Beathard and Nick Mullins much of the time. 2018, Garoppolo tears his ACL in week 3 or whatever it was. 2017, Garoppolo wasn't even on the team in week 1. It was Brian Hoyer. So when Shanahan has even semi-competent quarterback play, the Niners are a formidable franchise. But for Seattle, to me, it's not about comparing them to like the dregs of the NFL, because that's one of the pushbacks I have with fans very often is this notion that, oh, if you want to blow things up, if you want to reset, you can end up like Detroit or the Giants or the Jets. No, to me, the comparison point for a team like the Seahawks, which is now a undeniable winning franchise, is to compare yourself with the other winning franchises in the league. So your Green Bays, your New Englands, even Pittsburgh. I know Pittsburgh's not been winning many playoff games themselves, but they've been getting to the playoffs pretty regularly. So if you're an A student and you have a B grade or something like that in your exam, you're not going, at least I didn't get an F, are you? I mean, you're trying to compete with the top of your class.
Yeah.
And Seattle really has not been in that class for quite some time. I'd say 2016 was their last really good team. And even then, what happened? Russell Wilson got hurt in week 1, hurt again in week 3. They trotted out such a terrible offensive line that got him injured in the first place.
Uh,
And then Earl Thomas broke his leg, and the defense obviously suffered as a result of that.
yeah.
So they went from a potential first round bye to they get to beat Detroit, who doesn't beat Detroit in the playoffs whenever they make it, and then they get destroyed by Atlanta at the very next week. So 2017, disastrous season. That leads to the firing of 3 coordinators. Then 2018, I think they actually were a good team, but the Dallas game is just going to stick in everybody's mind for so long because they just lost in such a stupid way, which is to ram their head into a brick wall over and over again to the benefit of only the Cowboys and not themselves.
Yeah.
2019, they were lucky they didn't miss the playoffs because they played so many close games and they were on the right side of it more often than not. But what we're seeing in 2021, and maybe some of it is Wilson's injury, some of it is just, hey,
And again, beat Josh McCown in the playoffs.
yeah, beat Josh McCown and Carson Wentz in the playoffs. It's a good thing Stafford won on Monday against Arizona, because if he hadn't, then Seattle's last 3 playoff wins against Detroit, Minnesota, and
Yeah.
Philadelphia, not a single one of those starting quarterbacks has ever won a playoff game
Right.
up until this past week with Stafford. Bridgewater hasn't even been back as a starter, and I don't think he's
Which is
really
like, I mean,
gone
at
for
the end of the
himself.
day, like, do you find this fun? Do you think it's fun to go 10-6 or, whatever, 10-7? Like if 10-7 and, 13-4 is the ceiling with, first or second round playoff exits, it's like, is that fun? Is that, this isn't a position that Seahawks fans have been in many times before. The Seahawks were very good in 2005, and then we could go, and then the drop off happened as it did there. And that was not even just not fun. I think a lot of people just stopped tuning in for a little while, and then fun stuff started happening again. But is it still okay to go 12-5 and just have a really quick playoff exit? Because I don't know that I'm necessarily envious or thinking that anybody should be like, oh, I'm so envious of how the Dallas Cowboys did this year. No, not really. Like, goes 12-5, gets bounced out in ugly fashion, and it'll sort of ruin your off season.
Yeah, it does. Like, let me not get it twisted. I'd rather have 10 plus win seasons more often than not and have a shot in the playoffs than be Detroit or Houston and be 4 or 5 wins a lot of the time. Well, Houston more recently because they were a playoff team for a few years, but like Jacksonville for an example, like I don't want to be those loser franchises or the Giants or the Jets because it's just not fun to watch a team that has no hope of getting better. But for us, for Seahawks fans who are like really long time fans, they might say, look at the 90s. Seattle didn't make the playoffs for the whole of that decade until Mike Holmgren came in, but we're past that stage now. In the 21st century, Seahawks, when you combine the Holmgren era with the Carroll era, have made the playoffs all but like 4 or 5 years. That's really, really good. But when it's just the same thing over and over again, where, wow, this team is good enough to make the playoffs, but doesn't really look good enough to make it even to the conference championship, then you got to wonder how many more years do you want to do this before it's time to make serious changes. I mean, Green Bay, they were a perennial playoff team, and what did we see them do after a couple of playoff exits, even in the conference championship? Fired Mike McCarthy after 2 straight losing seasons. They get Matt LaFleur, and if they win this against the 49ers, they're going to be in the NFC championship game for the third straight season. And maybe that's the closest parallel for using Packers comparisons for what the Seahawks could do. So, like, if 2022 goes poorly and it doesn't look like Russell Wilson is the problem or the main problem, then yeah, you might want to consider moving on from Pete Carroll and finding a Matt LaFleur type of coach and retweaking your and tweaking your franchise so that you can still be competitive with the franchise quarterback that you have. Because
Yeah,
to me, it's easier to find a franchise head coach or a head coach who just doesn't suck compared to finding a franchise quarterback.
I think it's also it would be nice if Russell Wilson, it would be easier maybe per se if Russell Wilson was coming off of a better season also. Maybe held back to some degree, but overall, what would you say about Wilson's seasons or what his season before the finger injury, in those and even setting aside the first few games after the finger injury, how he ended the season? Clearly, how he ended the season was much different than most of the rest. But yeah, what was your overall take if the Seahawks go into next year with Russell Wilson as the quarterback and he plays over the first 2 months the way that he did, say, in the first 2 months prior to the finger injury? Like, what should we expect out of Seattle at that point?
Well, with Wilson, to me, he's a great quarterback and always has been a great quarterback, but he does have stretches where he just doesn't look like a top end starter. And he's had that pretty much every season of his career. But last season felt a little different because of the way he struggled. Some of the wayward throws that he was making, some of the sacks that he was taking that are even more different than the sacks he normally takes. So front office also has to consider, what does a Russell Wilson who is past his prime look like? Because even with this difficult year for Wilson and the injury and everything with the finger afterward, he still threw for what, 25 touchdowns to just 6 or 7 interceptions. And he was generally efficient before the injury. He was up and down after the injury, but he was great the last 2 games against Detroit and Arizona, for whatever that's worth. But what does a decline Wilson look like? Because to me, a past his prime Wilson is not going to be a turnover machine. I think that's ingrained in him to not be a guy who is just going to have 15 to 20 interceptions in a season. He rarely makes those types of reckless decisions. But one thing that I did notice this year, more than any other season, he was running a lot less. I don't even think he had but 20 earnest attempts to run the ball. So I'm including sneaks and scrambles and read option. In fact, I think he rushed for the fewest yards of his career, and I'm pulling up the stat now. And yeah, he ran for 183 yards on 43 attempts. Now, some of those are going to be nailed down, so we could subtract them, but still, 43 attempts, 183 yards, and a couple of touchdowns. And if you do that on a per game basis, he is averaging 3 rushes per game. And that is by far the fewest of his career. So to me, if Seattle's going to do anything with Wilson as far as building an offense around him, they have to prepare for Wilson not being the magician that we've been accustomed to, because his legs are not shot by any means,
Uh,
but you can tell just watching him run in a dead sprint, he's not as fast as he used to be. He's a little bigger than he used to be as well physically. But if this is going to be an offense that is predicated on too much Wilson magic, then they're in for a rude awakening.
Here's what I'll say about the interceptions, though. When your thoughts on this? You're right. Like I don't expect Russell Wilson to have a lot of turnovers. The Seahawks were first in turnovers. Fewest turnovers this year. And I talked a little bit about this with John Gilbert, and we decided, or at least we talked about it, and I think I decided, man, this turnovers thing, it's kind of like it's what a Pete Carroll kind of offense does, and Pete Carroll's offense isn't very good. And so it's like, and we look back at other coaches in history, it was like Buddy Ryan and Rex Ryan, and Jay Gruden was the only one that wasn't. Every other coach was a defensive minded coach. And it was all about this defensive minded coach of like, limit your turnovers, don't throw the interceptions, and, obviously play defense. But, this whole turnover thing, now, these are the 8 quarterbacks who are left in the playoffs, which is usually what I care about. I want to know who's in the playoffs. How are they doing? How did they get there? Who's consistently there? A lot of these guys, I think, are consistently there, or could be in the future. Matthew Stafford, he led the NFL in interceptions. Josh Allen, he was second behind Stafford and Lawrence, so he was third. He had 15 interceptions. Burrow and Tannehill, they had 14 interceptions. Mahomes had 13 interceptions. Brady and Garoppolo had 12 interceptions. And I'm starting to wonder, maybe Russell Wilson should throw some more interceptions. I mean, and maybe he is like, I could see him being the guy. He wants to be Aaron Rodgers. That's one guy, I guess, that I didn't mention in there. So Aaron Rodgers, he's obviously Aaron Rodgers. He's got 4 interceptions, but you're not Aaron Rodgers. And so like, what about just taking a few more like acceptable risks? Because sometimes Russell Wilson has some just like really off target throws, but what about taking some more acceptable risks and airing it out a little bit more? Because we know that he's capable, I think, of 40 touchdowns. Maybe not being so afraid of throwing a couple more picks.
Yeah, certainly he's not risk averse. Like he makes some incredible, improbable throws that few other quarterbacks can make. But his version of risk taking is to me a lot different than others. So like the strip sack that he took against Arizona to end the season, that's supposed to be a quick timing route to Tyler Lockett, short middle. He saw him and he just ducked, panicked in the pressure, sacked, fumbled, touchdown. If you look at Wilson's passing charts over the years through the next gen stats, Wilson targets the short and intermediate middle pretty much less often than most quarterbacks. And I think at this point this season, he was at the absolute bottom. So that seems to be the area where he is uncomfortable throwing to that part of the field. And I don't think it's a height thing either, because Kyler Murray's shorter than Russell Wilson and he attacks that part of the field more often. So maybe it's been drilled into him by Pete Carroll, because Pete's the one who stresses taking care of the ball, and he freaks out anytime a quarterback has some sort of turnover issue. But for Wilson, there are obviously some spots in his game that also make him not in the same category as Aaron Rodgers in terms of overall passing ability, where he will not make those types of throws because he just doesn't feel comfortable with them. Maybe he doesn't like to make those types of anticipatory throws where you throw a guy open or the receiver is supposed to be out of his route by the time the ball is there. He throws outside the numbers a ton. I mean, so does Aaron Rodgers, but Wilson does it so often. And maybe it's just a vision thing and what he's most comfortable with. But for Wilson, he's going to have to evolve as a quarterback. He has to keep evolving. And I mentioned the fact that he's not as super dangerous as a runner. Well, he's going to have to improve his skills in the pocket. And he has up to this point. I would take this version of Wilson as a pocket passer over his earlier work, but that means not panicking at the side of pressure or something that looks like pressure and then pretty much destroying the structure of the play. Like
Yeah.
he's going to have to see some guys who are not open by NFL standards and make that throw.
Yeah, and Shane Waldron, assuming that he's coming back, it looks like that will be the case. But Shane Waldron getting another opportunity. And as I said before on another podcast, just it's hard to watch Russell Wilson throwing passes to Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf with Rashad Penny gaining 150 yards and think it's time to blow this up. It's time to change. It's a very good football team in that respect. Then you go on defense and you go like, well, if these guys stay, it's a pretty talented defense here, there, and not everywhere, but here and there. And sometimes you're only a couple of breakout players away from competing again. I do think that there have to be changes, and I don't think that I don't know that Pete Carroll repeating, like anybody else, Pete Carroll has to adapt. Like Russell Wilson has to adapt, like you were talking about. Pete Carroll, he has to adapt too, and he's adapted a lot, I think, and he's made those attempts, like going after Shane Waldron or whatever, and now firing Ken Norton after 4 very, it's crazy that Ken Norton did as poorly as he did with the Raiders and then got to go coach the Seahawks, who had been the number 1 defense for 4 years. And it was truly kind of mind-blowing, but that is over at this point. I just think that Ken Norton can't be the guy to blame for what we said about not really looking like an elite team in maybe 3-4 years. So as far as whether or not the Seahawks can do that again, better play from Russell Wilson and better play from a lot of other people too, because Russell Wilson's certainly not part of the big problem. Then the Seahawks maybe could get to that point. I think the schedule next year looks pretty forgiving at home, and hate to project things out that far away, but it seems like it could open up thanks to the last place finish, and getting to play some of those last place teams. Before we wrap up here, Mookie, what would you say is the thing that you're most looking forward to in the next 3 months between the draft and free agency, and or maybe re-signing certain players?
I am looking forward to free agency because I want to see if Seattle is going to be a little bit different. So at the start of the podcast, we talked about the Green Bay model. Well, even they've been willing to break tendency. Like think about 2019. Zadarius Smith signs for a $66 million contract, and he gets 12 and a half sacks his first year, 13 and a half his second year. He's on injured reserve now, which is unfortunate for him, but they've been willing to splash the cash for certain guys. But for Seattle, it's just been, all right, 1 year here for Gerald Everett, another 2 years for, I don't know, Kerry Hyder. I think he was 3 years, and I'm not impressed with year 1, but it's just been that same model over and over again. And if there was ever a time to change it, it's now, because Wilson's only under contract for 2 more seasons, and Wilson could explore his options as much as he wants. But this ain't the NBA. You can't just say, I want out and then send me over to some other team. There's just not that level of player empowerment. But he's under contract. I don't think Seattle wants to trade him. And if they do try and trade him, there are going to be riots outside of Lumen Field. So they have to bolster this roster, because I'm still adamant that this is not even the 3rd best roster in the NFC West, which can only mean one thing: it's 4th. Like, can you honestly say that outside of quarterback, where on a year-to-year basis you'd say Wilson is the best, can you say the Seahawks have the best receiving core in the NFL when the Niners have Deebo Samuel and Ayuk and now Jawan Jennings, or the Rams have Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods when he's healthy and now Odell Beckham? Absolutely not. Best offensive line, not even a conversation. Best tight end, the Niners have Kittle, the Rams have Tyler Higbee, the Cardinals have Zach Ertz. On the defensive side, you think about the secondary, cornerbacks, Jalen Ramsey's with the Rams. You've got Buda Baker at safety for Arizona as one of the top guys in the league. On the defensive line, you've got Aaron Donald at the Rams as well. So basically, Seattle has to play catch up. And I think that should be what they have in mind, which is we've got to get to their level. The NFC West is not going to get any easier. So I hope that free agency is eventful for a change for Seattle. And I guess I'm looking forward to the schedule release because that road schedule is absolutely brutal. I mean, other than the
Yeah.
Lions, every other team on their away schedule finished above 500 this season. The three divisional opponents, New Orleans, and they were 9-8 playing a revolving door at quarterback. And then Tampa Bay, hopefully with Tom Brady retired, but I'm not banking on that. Kansas City and the Chargers, and then you have Detroit. So, and even Detroit, I think are better than their record suggested this season. They could surprise people next year. So, again, we're projecting very far into next season, but it's a must year for the Seahawks. Like if this season does not end in a conference championship game appearance and there's nothing freaky like Wilson tearing his ACL in week 1 and they got to play a backup quarterback the whole year, then I think there's no other option than to really press the reset button. And we might have to say goodbye to Wilson in that case, and Carroll and Schneider. And it's
Hmm.
been a great run. I wouldn't trade this for any other era of Seahawks football. And I've been a fan of this team since the Holmgren days. I mean, it's unforgettable. Brought this team a Super Bowl, almost brought them another, brought them countless playoff appearances and so many fun games and weird games and tremendous players and infectious personalities. But things do run their course. So Seattle might be hitting that point, and they could be just like Pittsburgh, where they're in need of a rebuild, but they wait until their quarterback is washed up to do it. Or they can be like Green Bay and extend Rodgers' prime and remain relevant, and not have to deal with searching for another quarterback.
My
I sure
fear
hope.
is that
Go
they
ahead.
just wind up as the Falcons.
You mean just kind of like in the Matt Ryan, they're some years they're in the playoffs and other years they're 7-9.
I mean, and some years they're 4-12. It's I think if you don't, that was a team that needed to face its reality a long time ago. But I feel like sometimes you have a quarterback who's pretty good, and then you go like, well, it's not like boring football. But I'm just looking at it now. The Falcons haven't won more than 7 games since 2017. They're just kind of there.
Yeah, and that's the year after the Super Bowl
Yeah.
collapse, and they've never been the same since then. And yeah, you could go. It's hard to be a bad team with a franchise quarterback. Well, we've got plenty of evidence to the contrary. Green Bay's had a couple of bad seasons with Aaron Rodgers fairly recently, and I just brought it up with McCarthy. Matt Ryan is not probably not a Hall of Famer, but he's a Hall of Very Good. And as you said, they haven't made the playoffs for 4 straight seasons. Philip Rivers could be a Hall of Famer if he ever had a deep playoff run or more than one. I mean, the Chargers have had a couple of bad years with him too. So you can have a high level quarterback, and then the rest of the team around you is not good enough, and you end up to get out of the playoffs. Or Deshaun Watson, and for all the stuff outside the field of play, like that was a 4-12 team last year, and he played every game, and he put up insane numbers, and that team was awful. So even though it shouldn't happen to the Seahawks because we've never had a full on disastrous 3-win type of year with Carroll, don't think it can't happen.
If the Seahawks do tank or bottom out next season, there is a lot of interesting stuff in the following draft. And then maybe the Seahawks, at that point, then you go, oh, wow, what if the Seahawks wound up with a top 3 pick? Then you would start saying time to try out a different philosophy, different head coach. Obviously, at that point, Russell Wilson, for whatever reason, if he was involved in a season that bad, either he was injured or he didn't play well, and definitely he would want out. And I think everyone would agree, time to make a change there. Sometimes I'm not rooting for an asteroid to hit Earth, but aren't we all kind of interested in watching an asteroid hit Earth? If not, why do I keep watching Greenland? So that's this episode of CISA Joe. You can follow Mookie on Twitter at Mookie Alexander. Follow at Field Goals. Mookie, anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Mookie Alexander. And of course, I am the managing editor over at Field Goals, and we'll be providing you plenty of off-season content and certainly keeping tabs on the Seahawks defensive coordinator search. Last year was the OC search, and now we got the DC search this year.
Yeah, OC to DC, and yeah, we will see what happens next. Hit subscribe on Seaside Joe, tell a Seaside friend, and come back next week for another guest and another Seahawks pre-building chat.